think we have a national emergency.
This is one of the things that we can shoot first and ask questions later. Normally you can't do that.
All of a sudden these trees started moving out of the way. They parted for me. And then I came out into this opening, and there where I saw Jesus Christ.
Back in 1927, an American socialist, Norman Thomas, 6 times candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, said the American people would never vote for socialism. But he said under the name of liberalism, the American people will adopt every fragment of the socialist program. He is more imminent.
James Madison, in 1788, speaking to the Virginia Convention, said, "Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations."
When men were free.
Broadcasting live from a secret location buried deep below the earth, you're about to make a connection to the signs of the times. W. Dean Shook is live on the air right now.
And welcome into End Time News. This is Alec Jones, and I've been proud and privileged to be able to sit in for Dean tonight because he's busy doing something else, and asked me if I'd be happy to fill in for him, and I said I would. It's a great honor for me to be on End Time News, and I'm glad to be here. And we're going to talk about false flags for the military complex, and everybody knows that this has to do with vaccinations, and everybody's going to die. So, let's get this out. Hey, what are you guys doing? Hey, he asked me to be here. Honest, he did. Hey, let go of me. Let go of me. And I am your host, W. Dean Shook. Who says security is a waste of money? Thank you very much for being here. This is End Time News. I am your host, W. Dean Shook. We are a iHeartRadio station. Welcome to all of our listeners on the iHeartRadio network, all of our regular broadcast affiliates, our internet affiliates, Blog Talk Radio, and the Spreaker Radio Network. Thank you for being here for this important program. Before we start it, though, I'd like to make an announcement. According to WND, in response to the intense pressure from the majority of the House and Senate, as well as a huge membership of the NRA and the GOA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms abruptly reverses its decision to ban the .556 and the M855 green tip ammo. Commonly popular used for home protection and sporting firearms, the reversal is a short-term victory for gun owners. ATF headquarters sent the following tweet. They said, "You spoke, we listened." Gun owners argued that the ATF had no legal or constitutional authority to ban the ammunition. The Obama administration buckled under the more than 80,000 comments received. A majority in both the Senate and the House, 52 senators and 238 House members, joined concerned citizens in opposing Obama's administrative move. It's good to see somebody step up and actually make some changes. If we can keep this momentum going, we can bring this country back. All right, well, just like it was mentioned earlier, this is going to be a program about false flags. And this kind of came about over the weekend when I was reading stories about how we're arming the Syrians and we're training them. And it says now that they're joining ISIS. Well, because of this, we're going to talk about false flags. Because there's a lot of things that are going on right now that just don't add up. We're going to talk first about the false flags, and then we're going to look at a history and see if there's a precedence for this. Now, because the people that listen to this program have a little bit higher Q than the average American, and your intellect is just slightly superior, and you have the gift of critical thought, then I'm going to be able to bring this to you and let you decide what's fact and what's fiction, if any of this actually applies or makes sense. I'm not going to say one way or the other. I'm just going to put it out there and let you decide. So I want to talk about some things that really don't make any sense at all. Let's talk about the Arab Spring, Libya, Yemen. Why did we train them and arm them and then watch them join ISIS or the terrorists in Iraq?
which, by the way, we left equipment and infrastructure in place when we pulled our troops out of Iraq. Despite the warning this would create a vacuum that would be filled in by these terrorists, which is exactly what happened. Now we have ISIS, who basically the United States has built, trained, and armed. And we're still training them in Syria. And then there's things like our southern border. Our southern border is wide open, even though we know for a fact Hezbollah has headquarters in South America. They've been found crossing our borders along with Boko Haram, the Somali terrorists, but not quite as many from them now that we're bringing them into the United States at 800 of them a month without background checks, moving them into Minnesota basically. Then they leave and go back to fight with Boko Haram, and we let them come right back in. And when we, the people, say we shouldn't be allowing these people to come back after they go and fight with Boko Haram, our government says we will not revoke their passports. They are welcome back, no problem. What about the no-go zones here in America? No one in the administration wants to do anything to prevent these terrorists from setting up shop in America. And then on top of that, they're doing all of these things and distracting us at the same time. Now, you remember the first Athens Games were played completely in the nude. Why? Because they knew the people would be at the naked games and not attending to government, who, while the people were distracted, ran amok. And what better way to distract us than things like homosexual marriage, taking away our gun rights, watch out for the transsexual who's in the bathroom with your young daughter, global warming, Hillary's emails, and the real effective one, racism. This whole racism thing is divide and conquer. It all has to do with discrimination, homophobia, Islamophobia, political correctness, immigration. I mean, come on, have you ever seen so many serious issues all coming up at the same time ever since Obama took office? It's one right after the other, nonstop. And at the same time, with every fear-mongering statement the government makes, they take another freedom from the people, baby step by baby step. Our dictator-in-chief seems to do whatever he wants, and no one's calling him on anything. Now, I'm not going to put out some grand conspiracy theory about false flags attacks that would give government full dictatorship over America, even though that's very possible. I'm not going to put it out there as that. Like I said, I'm going to present this and let you, the listener, decide what's fact, what's fiction, because it's probably a mix of both. You know, government-engineered false flag terrorism is a historically established fact. Political and financial elites have been sinking ships, setting buildings on fire, assassinating diplomats, overthrowing elected leaders, blowing people up, then blaming these disasters on scapegoats so they can induce fear in the public and transfer more power to themselves, and they've been doing this for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. A little bit later in the program, we're going to look at the history of false flags and how they've been used in the past, because the MO seems to be the same. Now, there's skeptics who are going to argue that certain calamities have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be false flag events, but no one can argue that these tactics have been used by the establishment in the past. Governments have openly admitted to creating bloody and catalyzing tragedies under false pretenses. And it's vital for the public to question the legitimacy of every so-called terrorist attack or geopolitical incident. Otherwise, we may find ourselves duped into supporting wars and unconstitutional actions. So the current threat and most useful scapegoat, of course, now is ISIS. Now, if your source of information was the mainstream media alone, you might be inclined to believe that ISIS has materialized out of nowhere to become a menace so organized and effective it has eclipsed Al-Qaeda as this hot-button boogeyman. ISIS is a disturbing military group, that goes without saying. But this raises the question about the Arab Spring. Look what happened in Libya. The Libyan civil war erupts as quote-unquote rebels are aided by the CIA and multiple foreign governments. These are the same rebels who would ultimately be part of the Benghazi raid on the consulate. Syrian insurgents, along with trained operatives, have also shifted into Syria, turning general civil unrest, which is how it started, into outright war. The U.S. has been secretly arming and training ISIS extremists in Syria for years. As we train them and we arm them, they go join ISIS. It wasn't until the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014, that it began a more open campaign to provide this support, not just training, but also weapons and ammunition. Now, it was insurgent Sunni majority groups that were trained in Jordan, funded by Saudi Arabia, that's linked up with these Saudi-funded groups in Iraq. These are not separate groups acting alone. These are U.S.-backed organizations acting in concert into one single movement, ISIS. Beheading, burning prisoners alive in cages, hangings, mass executions, as well as other torture, has really become a calling card of the established Organization of Islamic Groups, ISIS. And despite all of this, Obama's still sending over $500 million in aid to Syrian rebels. Obama says the funds and arms only go to moderate, well-vetted insurgents. The truth is, there are no moderate insurgents in Syria or anywhere else. These Islamists all have the same goal. And I think it's interesting, on the Council of Foreign Relations website, they argued that the inclusion of extremist al-Qaeda elements in the Syrian insurgency improved the morale of the movement. The Free Syrian Army needs al-Qaeda now. The Council for Foreign Relations acknowledges that the goal of al-Qaeda operatives in Syria is not necessarily to overthrow Assad, but to establish an Islamic state. And despite this, the CFR still continues its support for the strategy to overthrow Assad. Now, globalist organizations, along with Obama and his crew, including Hillary Clinton, now argue that the existence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the same ISIS insurgency that they created, requires the U.S. to execute airstrikes and military intervention in the region, and, of course, to remain fair and balanced, the White House proposes to strike Syrian government targets as well in order to avoid strengthening Assad. Well, you remember the Syrian crisis at the end of last year and how the U.S. and Russia were on the verge of conflict over Obama's funding this insurgency? And now the plan is to utilize airstrikes against the same insurgents that we had originally planned to help with airstrikes? Does this make any sense at all? And on top of this, they seem to be preparing us for some sort of upcoming event between the government and the mainstream media who work in concert. Senator James Inhofe, the top Republican of the Senate Armed Services Committee, claims that ISIS members are rapidly developing a method of blowing up a major U.S. city. Rick Perry of Texas claims that ISIS agents may have already crossed into the U.S. from Mexico. Well, that's already a proven fact. In the meantime, senators on both sides of the aisle are warning the Obama administration that ISIS is the best-funded terror group in history. And then they come out and tell us how they're trying to make their money, selling organs, harvesting organs out of the people they capture. Or you don't get this kind of money from that kind of stuff. These are funded by governments. Governments are the only ones who can afford to fund these people. And it looks like America is ripe for a large-scale false flag right here on American soil. Now, it may be a singular attack to a city or a region or some smaller attacks that are executed in concert, and the media is overloading us on ISIS fear. They're trying to condition the public to believe that ISIS will be the cause of whatever is going to happen if something's going to happen. They're spreading a myth that they're all sophisticated, international super-terrorist conglomerate, a real-life Legion of Doom. Well, if Americans are conned into buying this myth, they may be fooled into abandoning their constitutional liberties and natural freedoms, and they'll do it in the face of a well-planned attack blamed on ISIS. And we may very well be in a day when the mere act of exposing these lies or standing against government overreach, you'll be called a terrorist, accused of treason, and if net neutrality with the FCC is able to censor content based on what they consider to be harmful to others, shows like this one may be long gone. They might just say this is too harmful to the American people, you can't be on the air. Well, let's look at some false flags from the past. All the way from Nero back to 9/11, Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin, these are the all-time greatest hits of false flag operations. The most commonly known false flag operation consists of a government agency staging a terror attack, whereby an uninvolved entity gets blamed for the carnage, And at least 2 millennia have proven this. False flag operations have been used and successful. All you need are healthy doses of propaganda and ignorance provided by a great recipe for endless war. You know, in a book called The War is a Racket, a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient, General Smiley Butler, wrote, I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-ranked muscle man for big business and for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. He said, I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect their revenues in. I helped in the raping of a half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nigeria for the National Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902. He said he brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interest in 1916. He helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, he helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Well, you may not have heard of some of these, but here are some others that I bet you have heard of. In 64 AD, this is how far back it goes. This is the Great Fire from Nero. This fire burst through rooftops and shops near the mass entertainment of chariot racing called Circus Maximum. The flames, whipped by a strong wind, rapidly engulfed densely populated areas of the city. After burning uncontrolled for 5 days, 4 of the 14 Roman districts were burned to the ground. 7 more were severely damaged. It was no secret that Nero wanted to build a series of palaces, which he planned to name Neropolis. But the planned location was in the city, and in order to build Neropolis, a third of Rome would have to be torn down. Well, the Senate rejected the idea. Then, coincidentally, the fire cleared the very real estate that Neropolis required. Despite the obvious benefit, there's still a good probability that Nero did not start the fire. Up to 100 small fires regularly broke out in Rome each day. On top of that, the fire destroyed Nero's own palace, and it appears that Nero did everything he could to stop the fire. Accounts of that day say that when Nero heard about the fires, he rushed back from Antium to organize a relief effort. Using his own money, he opened his palace to let in the homeless and had food supply delivered to the survivors. Now it says Nero also devised a new urban development plan that would make Rome less vulnerable to fire. But although he put in place rules to ensure a safer reconstruction, he also gave himself a huge tract of city property with the intention of building his new palace there. People knew of Nero's plan for Neropolis, and all of the efforts to help the city could not contradict the rampant rumors that he'd helped start the fires, and his poll numbers dropped. Nero's administration released the need to employ False Flag 101. When anything bad happens to you, even if it's accidental, point the finger at your enemy. Now, luckily, there was a new cult of religious nuts at hand. The cult was unpopular because its followers refused to worship the emperor. It denounced possessions, held secret meetings, and they were always talking about the destruction of Rome and the end of the world. Even more lucky for Nero, 2 of the cult's biggest leaders, Peter and Paul, were currently in town. Nero spread word that the Christians had started the Great Fire. The citizens of Rome bought his lies, hook, line, and sinker. Peter was crucified, Paul was beheaded, hundreds of others in the young cult were fed to the lions and smeared with tar and set on fire to become human street lamps. When something bad happens, blame your enemy. Well, how about, have you ever heard of Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain? Well, this was the Spanish emperor with the first truly global empire. Reached its territorial height in the late 1700s. By 1898, Spain was losing territories regularly. Cuba, too, was becoming increasingly hard to control, and a minor revolution had broke out. This wasn't welcome news to the people of the United States, who owned Cuban sugar, tobacco, and iron industry properties valued at over $50 million. In today's worth, that'd be about $1.2 billion. The mainstream media, then documented by newspaper magnates Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, exaggerated and outright fabricated stories of horrible conditions under Spanish rule, followed by the age-old maximum, if it bleeds, it leads. The newspaper published stories about Spanish death camps, Spanish cannibalism and inhumane torture. The newspaper sent reporters to Cuba. However, when they got there, they found a different story. Artist and correspondent Frederick Remington wrote back to Hearst, "There is no war. Request to be recalled." Hearst famously replied, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." And he did. His newspaper continually screaming how Spanish Cuba was going to hell in a handbasket. And he was convinced big business interests in the U.S. to put pressure on anti-war President William McKinley to protect their Cuban investments. Well, McKinley, in response, sent the USS Maine battleship to Havana Harbor as a calming show of force. 3 weeks after arriving, on the night of February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded, killing 266 men. There were 2 theories for the explosion. Some believe the explosion was caused by an external mine that detonated the ship's ammunition magazines. Others say it was caused by spontaneous coal bunker fire that reached the ammunition magazines. Currently, the evidence seemed to favor the external mine theory. Well, without wanting an investigation, America's mainstream media blamed the tragedy on Spain and beat the drums for war. By April, McKinley yielded to public pressure and signed a congressional resolution declaring war on Spain. To help pay for the Spanish-American War, Congress enacted a temporary tax of 3% on long-distance telephone bills. This was essentially a tax on the rich, as only about 1,300 Americans even had phones in 1898. Now, although the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, the temporary tax was only abolished in 2005. Over its lifetime, the 107-year-old tax generated almost $94 billion, more than 230 times the cost of the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War put a large nail in the coffin of Spain's global empire. By the end of 1898, the United States, which was founded in opposition to imperialism, found itself in control not only of Cuba, but of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Hawaiian Islands. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. And for you historians, what about the Manchurian incident? I've always been intrigued by this one. This is described as following 1929's economic drop through a convincing near obliteration of Wall Street. It hit Japan especially hard. Exports fell. Unemployment rose. Japan, not being rich in natural resources, needed oil and coal to make power to run machines and produce goods to sell to other countries to make money to buy food to have enough energy. Manchuria, which is a province of China, had its fair share of oil and coal. After Japan decided it needed to invade Manchuria, they needed a pretext to justify the invasion. They chose to create a false flag attack on a railway close to Luciano Lake, a big flat area that had no military value to either the Japanese or the Chinese. The main reason the spot was chosen was for approximately 800 meters distance to Chinese troops stationed in Beiyang. The Japanese press labeled the no-name site of the latest Luchiagru, which was Japanese for Luciano Bridge. There was no bridge there, but the name helped convince some of the sabotage was strategic Chinese attack. Seems that colonial officers offered the regiment to place a bomb beneath the tracks. The original bomb failed to detonate. A replacement had to be found. Then on September 18, 1931, the tracks were blown. Surprisingly, the explosion was minor. Only one side of the rail was damaged. The damage was so light that a train headed for Shenyang passed by only a few minutes later. But it was a good enough excuse to invade. The Japanese immediately charged the Chinese soldiers with the destruction, then invaded Manchuria. A puppet government known as Manchuria was installed. The League of Nations investigated in 1932. They reported that the invasion was an act of defense, just as Japan had advertised, which of course was actually a false flag attack. And there's also the secrets of the Reichstag fire, 1933, just a week before general elections that might replace enough Nazis in office to make Hitler de facto dictator. The Reichstag, which housed the parliament of the German Empire, was set on fire. Adolf Hitler assured everyone that communist terrorists started the fire. Hitler's party member Hermann Göring stated that he had secret evidence that would soon be made public, evidence that proved communists did it. This proclamation came on top of weeks of Nazi-organized street violence designed to whip the public into a pathological fear of communists. The next day, the Nazis convinced senile President von Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag decree, the decree using defiance against terrorism as an excuse, suspended just about every major civil liberty set forth in the Weimar Constitution. Habeas corpus, the right to know why you're being put into jail, gone. Freedom of opinion, gone. Freedom of the press, gone. Freedom to organize and assemble, gone. The Reichstag decree even allowed the government to spy on its own citizens, personal mail and telephone conversations without a warrant. Sound familiar? Something most Americans today could hardly begin to fathom, right? A precursor to George W. Bush's secret order in 2002, ordering the National Security Agency to do just exactly the same thing. So what about the fire? The only thing historians seem to agree on is that Marianus van der Lubbe, a former Dutch communist and mentally disturbed arsonist hungry for fame, was found inside this building. Despite the Nazi attempt to blame the fire on a group of communists, the communists were later acquitted by the Nazi government itself. After years of extensive investigation, most historians believe the Hitlerites themselves set the fire at the Reichstag, using van der Lubbe as their patsy. They knew a nut was going to try to burn down the building, and not only did they let him do it, but they may have befriended him, encouraged him, and even helped the blaze spread by scattering gasoline and incendiaries. Then most Germans, feeling safe from terrorism again, didn't mind that their freedoms and liberties had been stolen, or that so much of their lives and work had become so strictly controlled. On the contrary, they felt very enthusiastic and patriotic about the new government because they ignorantly believed the new government cared about them. And as long as the average citizen worked hard, kept his mouth shut, and let his kids take part in the Hitler Youth Organization, they stayed out of the detention camps. Sound familiar? Well, what about the fake invasion of Gleiwitz? Historians say this. In the late evening of Thursday, August 31st, 1939, German court operatives, pretending to be Polish terrorists, seized the Gleiwitz radio station in the German polar border region of Silesia. The station's music program came to an abrupt halt, followed by frantic German voice announcing that Polish informants were marching toward town. Germany was being invaded by Poland. Then, like a bad imitation of the previous year's infamous War of the Worlds broadcast, the transmission went dead for a moment of dramatic silence. Soon the airwaves popped and crackled to life again. At this time, Polish voices called for all Poles in the broadcast area to take up arms and attack Germany. Well, in no time, radio stations across Greater Europe picked up the story. The BBC broadcast statement said this: there have been reports of an attack on a radio station in Gleiwitz, which is just across the border in Silesia. German news agencies report the attack came about 8 p.m. this evening when the Poles forced their way into the radio station and began broadcasting a statement in Polish. Within quarter of an hour, reports said the Poles were overpowered by German police who opened fire on them. Several of the Poles were reported killed, but the numbers were not known yet. At this, Hitler invented an excuse to invade Poland, which he did the next day. This was the beginning of World War II. What really happened? Alfred Nowak received the orders, Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, to put the staged terrorist attack together at this Gleiwitz station. At Nowak's disposal were what the Germans codenamed canned goods, which were dissenters and criminals kept alive in detention camps till the Gestapo needed a warm, dead body. Then to add coherency to the Gleiwitz attack, Nowak brought along Franzisk Honeck, a German. He was known as a Polish sympathizer. Before arriving at the station, the Gestapo gave him a lethal injection. Then they dressed him up like a Polish terrorist, brought him to the front of the radio station, Jacques later testified that the man was unconscious but not dead yet when he was shot full of pistol rounds. Then the police and press found Honeck's body. They assumed he had been one of the fictional Polish terrorists that attacked the station. All in all, there were 21 fake terror attacks along the border that same night, many of them using quote-unquote canned goods from German prisons, so there'd be plenty of bodies in the morning. Evidence of Polish attackers that had been shot in self-defense. Well, the next day, after a long night filled with fake terror, Hitler gave a speech to the German army, complete with synthetic anger. The Polish state had refused the peaceful settlement of relations which I desired, he said, and has appealed to arms. Germans in Poland are persecuted with bloody terror and driven from their houses. A series of violations on the frontier, intolerable to a great power, prove that Poland is no longer willing to respect the frontier of the Reich. In order to put an end to this lunacy, I have no other choice than to meet force with force from now on. The German army will fight the battle for honor and the vital rights of reborn Germans with hard determination. I expect that every soldier, mindful of the great tradition of eternal German soldiery, will remain conscious that he is a representative of the National Socialist Greater German Army. Long live the people of our Reich. And had it not been for the Nuremberg trials in 1945, the real story behind the Glarwitz attack might have never been uncovered. It was there that the operation leader, Alfred Najaks, spilled the beans in a written affidavit where he admitted this whole thing. Now, what about Pearl Harbor? You know, there's been some talk about Pearl Harbor and what happened there. You know, we're going to start getting into some more current events now, from Pearl Harbor right up to 9/11. And we're going to talk about 9/11 at the end of the program because 9/11 deserves both sides to be heard. There's actually an argument for both sides, things that don't add up on both sides. But we're going to start with Pearl Harbor right after this short break of what they're saying they knew and didn't know, who knew it, and when did they know it. And we're going to do that right after this short break.
You're listening to a global pioneer in the new mainstream media. End Time News with W. Dean Shook. Your connection to the signs of the times.
We have assumed control. We have assumed control. We have assumed control.
Concerning that, though, there's a lot of emails going around. It gets rather terrible. A Newsweek poll shows that 12% of America believes that you're a Muslim, and 26% believe you were raised in a Muslim home. A lot of misinformation. How do you fight that?
Well, you know, by getting on Larry King and telling everybody I'm a Christian and I wasn't raised in a Muslim home, and pledge allegiance to the flag, and you know, all the things that have been reported in these emails are completely untrue and have been debunked again and again and again. So all you can do is just tell the truth and trust in the American people that over time they're going to know what the truth is.
Assalamu alaikum. Many other Americans have Muslims in their families or have lived in a Muslim-majority country. I know because I am one of them. But my father came from a Kenyan family that includes generations of Muslims. As a boy, I spent several years in Indonesia and heard the call of the azan at the break of dawn. I have known Islam on 3 continents before coming to the region where it was first revealed. That experience guides my conviction.
There is a sense in the world. There's a sense among believers, there's a sense among unbelievers, there's a sense among all peoples that things are unhinged. The Middle East is unhinged with uprisings, revolutions, and where's it heading?
How are followers of Jesus to relate to all of these things? How do they relate to biblical prophecy?
America is in spiritual, moral crisis. Values are changing, and so rapidly, I mean, that have not happened in the history of man.
How are level-headed, responsible Christians to relate to the testimony of the biblical prophets and the unfolding of chaos throughout the world?
Not just believers are wondering, is this a sign of the end?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. We either stand up to supporters of terrorism, or we and our allies risk losing the freedom we cherish. We must not let the jihadist government of Iran get a nuclear bomb. President Obama has had opportunity to stop them, but he's failing. Join with us, and let's secure America now.
Hi, folks. Have you noticed the federal government and police departments are using drones for everything? Drones are expensive. They're hard to fly. It can take up to a week just to learn to make a drone hover. Not anymore. There's a new generation of drones that are not only affordable but very easy to fly. Now, you can have your own personal drone, anything from a micro mini that'll fit in the palm of your hand, right up to a full-scale model, 10 inches in diameter like the model I have, the V949 Pro. Comes with a 6-axis, 4-rotor blade, and an HD 2.4 camera mounted on the bottom. These drones are made of a space-age polymer. They're durable. And don't worry about crashing your drone. Replacement blades for this drone from the website are only $1.80 for a pack of 4. That's right, I said $1.80 for a pack of 4 replacement blades. You can also get an extra long life battery. This battery allows you up to a half hour of flight time with a maximum speed of 40 miles an hour. Have your own personal drone, and you can get all of this for under $70. If you go to the website, wdeanshook.com, and click on the banner on the webpage, you can get from 7 to 22% off your personal drone. It's shipped as a kit. You can be up and flying your own personal drone with an HD camera within a half hour. Come to the webpage, wdeanshook.com. Click on that banner and get your discount today. wdeanshook.com.
You know, it seems these days that not a single one of us steps on a train, boards an airplane, attends a concert or a sporting event that doesn't have at least a fleeting concern that terror could strike. The reality of the post-9/11 world is that we're at war and we are a target. We all live with some level of uncertainty and fear. It's easy to lose sight of an issue that defines our generation, the need to stop terrorism in our time. Our president apologizes for America, and he's made it clear that the era of American exceptionalism is over. He campaigned on closing Guantanamo and trying terrorists in civilian court. On his second day in office, he stopped enhanced interrogation and he closed down the black sites. You know, where we got the intel that ultimately led us to bin Laden. He has all but abandoned Israel despite the fact that Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terror, that openly calls for the annihilation of Israel, all while Iran develops a nuclear bomb that they recently announced could be delivered to U.S. targets via missiles developed during Obama's presidency, while he does nothing but talk. The question for every American is simply, are we safer? AreWeSafer.com provides you with the facts and the potential consequences of these failed policies so that you can make informed decisions. I mean, let's face it. If things don't change, everything will change. And we all hope that day never comes.
GoDaddy offers everything you need to make a name for yourself on the web, from domain names and website builders to complete e-commerce solutions. We've earned our place as the world's #1 accredited domain registrar by delivering world-class products at competitive prices and support them with industry-best services delivered 24/7, 365. We're proud to serve our customers from locations around the world. Sign up now at WDeanShook.com and get your domain name as low as $5.99 a year. Sign up now at WDeanShook.com. Go, Daddy. Go, Daddy.
Do you think the media is biased? Maybe they're leaving something out, or there's something they're not telling you. Now, you have a source for the truth in the news. W. Dean Shook, End Time News. Your connection to the signs of the times.
All right, thank you for that break. I appreciate it very much. We had to run a little security check, make sure we didn't have any more invaders. So let's talk about the myth of Pearl Harbor. Here's what they're saying. Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, Japanese launched an attack at Pearl Harbor that decimated the U.S. Pacific Fleet and forced the United States to enter World War II. That's what most of us were taught as school children, except for the date. Everything you just heard, according to them, is a myth. In reality, there was no sneak attack. Now, just like you, when I read that, I said, now come on. Well, they say the Pacific Fleet was far from destroyed. Furthermore, the United States took great pains to bring about the assault. Come on. I just had a problem believing that. Well, they say that on January 27th, 1941, Joseph C. Crew, U.S. Ambassador to Japan, wired Washington that he had learned of a surprise attack on September 24th. A dispatch from Japanese Naval Intelligence to the Consul General in Honolulu was deciphered. The transmission was a request for a grid of the exact location of ships in Pearl Harbor. Surprisingly, Washington chose not to share this information with the officers at Pearl Harbor. Then, November 26th, the main body of the Japanese strike force, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, 23 fleet submarines, and 5 midget submarines, departed from Japan for Hawaii. They say despite the myth that the strike force maintained strict radio silence, U.S. Naval Intelligence intercepted and translated many dispatches. There was no shortage of dispatches. Tokyo sent over 1,000 transmissions to the attack fleet before it reached Hawaii. Some of these dispatches, in particular this message from Admiral Yamamoto, left no doubt that Pearl Harbor was the target of the Japanese attack. The task force headed this movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into the Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X Day, exact date to be given by later order. Even on the night before the attack, U.S. intelligence decoded a message pointing that Sunday morning was a deadline for some kind of Japanese action. The message was delivered to the Washington High Command more than 4 hours before the attack at Pearl Harbor, but as many messages before, it was withheld from Pearl Harbor commanders. Although many ships were damaged at Pearl Harbor, they were all old and slow. The main targets of the Japanese attack fleet and the Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, but Roosevelt made sure that these were safe from the attack. In November, at about the same time as the Japanese fleet left Japan, Roosevelt sent the Lexington and Enterprise out to sea. Meanwhile, the Saratoga was in San Diego. So why did Pearl Harbor happen? They say because Roosevelt wanted a piece of the war pie. Having failed to bait Hitler by giving $50 billion in war supply to Britain, Roosevelt switched focus to Japan. Basically, Roosevelt knew war with Japan was a legitimate backdoor to joining the war in Europe. On October 7, 1940, one of Roosevelt's military advisors, Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCullum, wrote a memo detailing an 8-step plan that would provoke Japan into attacking the United States. Over the next year, Roosevelt implemented all 8 of the recommended actions. In the summer of 1941, the U.S. joined England in an oil embargo against Japan. Japan needed oil for its war with China, had no remaining options but to invade the East Indies and Southeast Asia to get new resources. That required getting rid of the U.S. Pacific Fleet first. Although Roosevelt may have got more than he bargained for, he clearly let the attack on Pearl Harbor happen, even helped Japan by making sure the attack was a surprise. He did this by withholding information from Pearl Harbor's commanders and even by ensuring the attack force wasn't accidentally discovered by commercial shipping. As Rear Admiral Richard K. Turner stated in 1941, "We are prepared to divert traffic when we believed war was imminent. We sent the traffic down via the Torres Strait so that the track of the Japanese task force would be clear of any traffic." Was that a false flag or just a huge blunder? Well, how about July 1954? Israeli terrorist cell uncovered in Egypt. This was an Israeli terrorist cell that was activated inside Egypt. The ensuing attack, cleverly designed to look like the works of Arabs, blasted and torched American and British targets. First, the Israeli terrorists firebombed the Alexandria post office. Then they firebombed the U.S. Information Agency libraries, one in Alexandria, one in Cairo. Then they firebombed a British-owned Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer theater, a railway terminal, the Central Post Office, and a couple more theaters. To smuggle their bombs inside the buildings, the terrorists used a device shaped like books, hiding them inside book covers. Once inside, bags filled with acid were placed on top of the nitroglycerin bombs. After several hours, the acid ate through the bags and ignited the nitroglycerin, causing explosions and a blazing inferno. In the early 1950s, the United States was making fast friends with Egypt, taking advantage of the new pan-Arab Egyptian government of Gamal Nasser. The warming relationship between the U.S. and Egypt caused a very insecure Israel to feel threatened. Nasser also planned to nationalize the Suez Canal, which had been controlled by the British for decades. Egypt had been known to blockade Israeli shipping through the canal, and Israel feared Nasser would make a blockade permanent. So after U.S. President Eisenhower began encouraging the British to leave the Suez Canal zone, Israel started looking for a way to make the British stay, and a way to remain best buddies with America. And what better way to treat your best friend than to stab them in the back and tell them their other friend did it? David Gurion, Israel's founding prime minister, thought that Egypt terrorist attacks against America would be a perfect way to cool the growing U.S.-Egyptian relationship. Since there were no Egyptians planning an attack against Americans, Gurion's protégés did the next best thing. They recruited Israeli agents to pretend to be Egyptian terrorists. The top-secret Israeli terrorist cell, Unit 131, had existed since 1948. In 1950, Israel's military intelligence was created, and Israel sent an undercover agent, Colonel Abraham Dar, to recruit more members to Unit 131. He also trained them in how to build bombs and terrify Americans and British civilians working and living in Egypt. Before the terrorist cell was activated, another Israeli agent named Avram Sandberg was sent to take control from... Before the terrorist cell was activated, Israeli agent named Avram Sandberg first went to Germany to establish an ally. He assumed the identity of Paul Frank, a former SS officer, complete with underground Nazi connections. By 1954, his new identity was in place, and he went to Egypt to take command of the Unit 131. Everything was going well for the Israeli terrorists. It seemed there was one thing the members of 131 didn't know. Their terrorist sleeper cell had itself been infiltrated by the Egyptian intelligence service. The new Unit 131 leader, Sandberg, had betrayed them to the Egyptians. So when Unit 131 member Philip Nathanson made his way to bomb the British-owned Rio Theater in Alexandria, not only was he being followed, the Egyptian intelligence service had a fire engine waiting to put out the flames. As Nathanson stood in the ticket line, his bad luck turned worse when one of the bombs in his pocket ignited and then exploded. Nathanson was burned but not killed, as nearby pedestrians shouted warnings and wondered if it was a suicide bomber. Egyptian policemen stepped in, calmed the crowd, identified Nathanson as one of the terrorists who had been blowing up American and British buildings. Nathanson was interrogated by Egypt's military intelligence and confessed to the whole plot, which led to more arrests. When the Israeli spies were given a public trial, all of the details of their terrorist training in Israel came to light. Former Israeli Prime Minister Gurion tried to frame their own defense ministers. They even offered forged documents as proof. The frame-up worked for a while, so much that the entire incident is still popularly known as the Lavon Affair. Lavon resigned, and Ben-Gurion came out of political retirement to replace him as Israel's defense minister. However, the truth did finally emerge in 1960. A review of the inquiry discovered the fake documents, as well as perjury by Sonnenberg. The committee of 7 cabinet members cleared Lavon. Although Ben-Gurion never admitted fault, he did resign his post as defense minister. And what about Operation Northwoods in 1962? The U.S. Joint Chief of Staff unanimously proposed a state-sponsored act of terrorism on American soil against American citizens. The head of every branch of the U.S. Armed Forces gave written approval to sink U.S. ships, shoot down hijacked American planes, and gun down and bomb civilians on the streets of Washington, D.C. and Miami. The idea was to blame the self-inflicted terrorism on Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro. This was so the American public would beg and scream for the Marines to storm Havana. The public learned about the Operation Northwoods 35 years later, when the top-secret document was declassified by JFK during an assassination records review board, among other things. Operation Northwoods proposed the following: faking the crash of an American passenger plane. The disaster was to be accomplished by faking a commercial flight from the U.S. to Jamaica, having the plane boarded at a public airport by CIA agents disguised as college students going on vacation. An empty remote control plane would follow the commercial flight as it left Florida. The commercial flight's pilot would radio for help, mention that they had been attacked by a Cuban fighter, then land in a secret Elgin Air Force base. The empty remote control plane would then be blown out of the sky, and the public would be told all of the poor college students were killed. It was also using a possible NASA disaster, with John Glenn's death as a pretext to launch the war. The plan called for manufacturing various pieces of evidence which would prove electronic interface on the part of the Cubans if something went wrong with NASA's third manned space launch. There was also one blowing up buildings in Washington and Miami. Cuban agents, undercover CIA agents, would be arrested, then would confess to the bombings. In addition, false documents proving Castro's involvement in the attack would be found and given to the press. There was another one planned, attacking an American military base in Guantanamo with CIA agents posing as Cuban mercenaries. This involved blowing up the ammunition depot and would obviously result in material damage and many dead American troops. As a last resort, the plan even mentioned bribing one of Castro's commanders to initiate the Guantanamo attack. Now, I think that deserves repeating. The Pentagon considered using our tax dollars to bribe another country's military to attack our own troops in order to initiate a full-scale war. And Operation Northwoods was only one of several plans under the umbrella of Operation Mongoose. Shortly after the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented the plan in March of 1962, President Kennedy, still smarting from the Bay of Pigs fiasco, declared he would never authorize a military invasion of Cuba, and in September, Kennedy denied the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Limitzer, a second term as the nation's highest-ranking military officer, and by the winter of 1963, Kennedy was dead, killed, apparently, by a Cuban sympathizer in the streets of an American city. Maybe that actually explains Kennedy's assassination. There's something to consider. How about the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964? 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked a U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox. The boats reportedly fired torpedoes at the U.S. ship in international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin, about 30 miles west of the Vietnam coast. On August 4th, the U.S. Navy reported another unprovoked attack on the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. Within hours, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered a retaliatory strike. As the bases for North Vietnamese torpedo boats were bombed, Johnson went on TV and told Americans that repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with a positive reply. The reply is being given as I speak tonight. The next day, Secretary of State Robert McNamara assured Capitol Hill that the Maddox had only been carrying out a routine mission of the type we carry out all over the world all the time. McNamara said the two boats were in no way involved in the recent South Vietnamese boat raids against North Vietnamese targets. Of course they weren't. At Johnson's request, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The resolution pre-approved any military actions Johnson would take. It gave Johnson a free ticket to wage war in Vietnam as large as the president wanted. And true to his large Texas roots, Johnson gave a big war. In 1969, over 500,000 troops were fighting in Indonesia. Despite McNamara's testimony to the contrary, the USS Maddox had been providing intelligence support to South Vietnamese boats carrying out raids against North Vietnam. McNamara had also testified there was unequivocal proof an unprovoked second attack against the USS Maddox. In fact, the second attacks never occurred at all. At the time of the second incident, the two U.S. destroyers misinterpreted radar and radio signals as attacks by the North Vietnamese Navy. It's now known that no North Vietnamese boats were even in the area. So for 2 hours, the two U.S. destroyers blasted away at a non-existent radar targets and vigorously maneuvered to avoid phantom North Vietnamese ships. Even though the second attack only involved two U.S. ships defending themselves against a non-existent army, the President and Secretary of Defense used it to coerce Congress and the American people to start a war they neither wanted or needed. And after the Vietnam War turned into a quagmire, Congress decided to put limits on the President's authority to unilaterally wage war. Thus, on November 7th, 1973, Congress overturned President Nixon's veto and passed the War Power Resolution. It requires the President to consult with Congress before making any decision that engages the U.S. military in hostility. And it's still in effect today. Even though our current President doesn't think it applies to him, it does. All right, I want to take a couple minutes here and talk about the September 11 attacks. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy out there. There's a lot of people that say that they have unequivocal proof that this was a false flag attack. There's others that say there's just no way. Well, I read through this first, and they make a very good case for why it could have been a false flag attack. But my problem is, I have a real problem thinking that someone would sacrifice 3,000 lives for a false flag attack. Now, I fully understand man's inhumanity toward man, that people that are thirsty for power can do some pretty devastating things. So let's see what they're saying here about 9/11, and you decide. Here's what they're saying. That like many other buildings in the 1970s, the Twin Towers were constructed with vast quantities of cancer-causing asbestos. The cost of removing the Twin Towers asbestos? A year's worth of revenues at minimum, possibly as much as the value of the buildings themselves. The cost to disassemble the Twin Towers floor by floor would have run into the double-digit billions. In addition, the Port Authority was prohibited from demolishing the towers because the resulting asbestos dust would cover the entire city, which it did when they collapsed, resulting in many cancers with a confirmed link to the World Trade Center dust. And despite its questionable status, in January 2001, Larry Silverstein made a $3.2 billion bid for the World Trade Center on July 24th. The Port Authority accepted the offer. Silverstein then took out an insurance policy that understandably covered terrorist attacks, which happened 7 weeks later. To date, Silverstein has been awarded almost $5 billion from 9 different insurance companies. And what was an asbestos nightmare turned into a $1.8 billion profit in 7 weeks. Donald Rumsfeld said the Pentagon on the morning of September 10th, 2001, according to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. This bombshell was pretty much forgotten by the next morning, so as a reward for losing $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America, taxpayers patriotically forked over another $370 billion and counting to invade Iraq. True to form, the Pentagon promptly lost $9 billion of that money, too. 8 days after the attack, the 342-page Patriot Act was given to Congress. The same week, letters armed with anthrax from a U.S. library lab entered the mail. Subsequently, while congressional offices were evacuated, examined, cleaned, and nasal cavities swabbed, the Patriot Act remained largely unread. Then, with little debate, the Patriot Act became law, giving President Bush unprecedented power to access people's medical records, tax records, information about the books they bought or borrowed, and the power to conduct secret residential searches without notifying owners that their homes had been searched. According to statements by Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, a Bronze Star recipient with 22 years of experience in intelligence operations, a classified intelligence program, codenamed Able Danger, had uncovered 2 of the 3 9/11 terrorist cells a year before the attacks had been identified. Schaefer alerted the FBI on September of 2000, but the meetings he tried to set up with Bureau officials were repeatedly blocked by military lawyers. 4 credible witnesses have come forward to verify Schaefer's claims. In August of 2001, a Pan American Flight Academy instructor warned the FBI that a student, Zacharias Moussaoui, might use a commercial plane loaded with fuel as a weapon. The instructor asked, "Do you realize that a 747 loaded with fuel can be used as a bomb?" Moussaoui was then arrested on immigration charges, but despite the repeated urging of the school and the local agents, FBI headquarters refused a deeper investigation. The U.S. also received dozens of detailed warnings, names, locations, and dates from the intelligence agencies in Indonesia, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Egypt, Jordan, India, Argentina, Morocco, Russia, Israel, France, and even the Taliban. It would seem the entire world was onto the bungling Saudi hijackers of somewhat perplexed that the U.S. wasn't taking preventative actions. But in any case, the U.S., as if by design, chose not to investigate. Instead, Condoleezza Rice, on May 16, 2002, said, "I don't think anybody could have predicted that these people would take an airplane, slam it into the World Trade Center, take another one and slam it into the Pentagon." We also know on the morning of 9/11, multiple Air Force war games and drills were in progress. The hijackers would have never made it to their targets without these war games. Operation Northern Vigilance assured that many fighter jets would have normally been patrolling the East Coast were flying over Alaska and northern Canada in a drill that simulated a Russian air attack, complete with false radar blips. Remarkably, Operation Vigilant Guardian simulated attack planes in the northeastern sector, while real hijackers were in the same airspace. This drill had NORAD and the Air Force reacting to false blips on FAA radar screens. Some of these blips corresponded to the real military aircraft in the air posing as hijacked aircraft. That's why when NORAD Airborne Control Officer Lieutenant Colonel Dwayne Deskins heard Boston claim it had a hijacked airliner, his first words were, "It must be part of the exercise." So if you follow the money, they say that you can see that the people with the most to gain occupied these key military and civilian positions to help 9/11 happen, as well as to cover up the crime. And such is the hallmark of false flag operations throughout history. See the incredible scale of all of these shams, the sheer number of people who still refuse to see the mountain of truth in front of their eyes when it comes to this stuff. And what makes this September 11th, 2001 attack the greatest false flag operation of all time? Well, Hermann Göring said naturally the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it's the leader of the country who determines policy. And it's always a simpler matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship, voice or no voice. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leader. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked. Denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Adolf Hitler wrote a book that's forbidden in some countries. He said, in the size of the lie, there is always contained a certain factor of credibility, since the great masses of the people will more easily fall victim to the great lie than to a small one. So let's consider what the U.S. is doing right now with saying that they keep wanting to arm everybody. They want to arm people in the Ukraine, in Syria. They want to arm and train them in Yemen. They want to arm and train them in Iraq. All of these global Islamists have the same idea. It's all the same thing. It's all the same goal. Why do we keep training and arming all of these people who just turn against us and the rest of the world? What is going on here? You know, I brought up the whole false flag thing because I think it's worth considering. What they're doing doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm not saying any or all of these past things are true, because we weren't there. We don't know the political situation then. It's hard to tell if this was actually fact. I'm sure some of it was. Everything is based in fact. What we need to determine now, why is the American government training all of these Islamists all over the Middle East? It's something to think about. You can email me at contact@wdeanshook.com. The homepage is wdeanshook.com. Twitter is wdeanshook. And as usual, when the dust settles and the smoke clears, I'll be back to give you more truth in the news.
You can get these full stories and more at wdeanshook.com. That's wdeanshook.com.